They did not go to the lake during the next week or afterwards. Even though he had gotten used to the new set of tasks quickly, it still kept him busy because he lacked efficiency and tended to forget a task or two and had to go back. Already on his second day, Frederick declared it to be most valuable to create a structured checklist so he himself would not have to look after the trustworthy person of the king. Dew still hated that title and told his chef to refrain from using it, but the old man thought it to be amusing, and Dew didn't dare to explain his reasoning behind his rage. The checklist actually proved itself to be as effective as it could be. 1.5 weeks in, and it had become part of Dew's day-to-day routine. Sometimes Sean stayed with him during the end to be company to him or just to help. Most of the time it did exhaust him to a degree where he would even sleep through half the afternoon, which was a behavior he hoped to get rid of. To him it was nothing more than wasted time, and he really wanted to go to the lake. Slowly April passed by, and the weather swings turned down. If it was cloudy in the morning, it would be cloudy during sunset as well, or it would rain before that. If it was sunny, with barely any clouds covering the bright blue sky, one would be able to see the countless stars during the night, a sight most enjoyable from a high place like Dew's room, or a giant field where no buildings nor trees could block the view. The time when Josephine took him out to go to visit her husband, she confirmed a suspicion everyone in the kitchen had had, but never dared to speak out. She was awaiting her first child and seemed quite excited about it. Dew couldn't fully understand it. He couldn't imagine how someone would be willingly to take on the risk of pregnancy, which could end with lasting damage on one's body or even death. At least that was what he had heard all over the place. Yet he still felt happy for her, a person who had so much care to give, and whose wish it had always been to start a family of her own. Another thing Dew couldn't relate to, but maybe that was just because he never had a real family. Maybe his mother, she did show some sort of affection to him, but it lacked what he saw between Sean's wife and her children, or even Tiana and her mother: communication, support, and attention. After what could be seen as happy news by Josephine, she had a rather shocking revelation to make. Patrick, the careless and light-hearted wannabe powerful knight, would be moved into a different unit during June, one with the same field of task as Avery's. Immediately, Dew realized that his female colleague did not fully know what that would imply, just that he could possibly be sent to war, and that was enough to plague her with worries. But Dew was primarily worried of the impact of the other kinds of tasks Patrick would have to do from time to time. Avery barely talked about it, but whenever he did, Dew ended up more and more disgusted. Not by Avery, okay, maybe a little, but by the people who invented and insisted on using those methods. Losing a finger was comparably harmless, and this meant something. He couldn't imagine having a limb of his being chopped off, even if it was that small, and he did have 10 of those at his disposal. Dew didn't mention it around her, though. She was paranoid enough, so he just comforted her by saying things like, "The mortality rate is quite low," or "How high are the chances of a battle breaking out very soon?" But it didn't exactly have the effect he wished for, which meant she started shaking and crying. He would be rich if he would get a day's worth of payment every time he made a person feel large amounts of emotional distress, at least if he was included as well. What it meant to be someone's reason to live he couldn't exactly figure out even after a month, but he noticed how Avery returned to his old self with dry and dark humor, and an average amount of energy whenever any of his acquaintances were nearby. Whether it was an act or an actual upswing in mood was unclear to Dew for most of the time, but there were moments where he was certain all of the dark thoughts in the hybrid's mind had moved into a spot somewhere in the back where they wouldn't cause any harm soon. Avery refrained from skipping many shifts, which he had done quite often during his first week after the proposal. Sue and Dew didn't directly talk whenever they saw each other in the hallways. A nod was greeting enough, but Avery hinted at her being interested in Dew's well-being. That way he guessed Avery had stopped talking too much about him in her presence. A similar behavior could be seen with Josephine. She frequently asked how his roommate was doing, if he was still training with her husband, and if Dew and him went out for a walk from time to time. The truth was that they didn't do the latter. There was just no time, even though he desperately wished there to be some, and the frustration was renewed every day. The only longer period of time they could spend together were the nights, and to his surprise Avery wasn't damned to work at that time anymore. When he had asked his new partner why he didn't have night shifts anymore, he had kept quiet. Even then there wasn't much to do. Most of the time they would have small talk over what had happened during the day, which wasn't much, and sometimes Stu would let himself be embraced, a gesture he didn't initiate but apparently seemed interested in. He certainly was scared of the other one's anatomy, and that one wrong word or movement could ruin everything, but before he could overthink anything he fell asleep, woke up, and everything was fine. During May it began to happen more often that Avery would actually join him at his late duties, which was like a blessing to the cat who apparently disliked Du's constant presence. Then he would dry the dishes for him while talking or just enjoying having each other's presence without being in a bad mood. This caused him to finish quicker because the other tended to refuse to do the new shifts assigned to them after Charles' death. Du guessed it was fear of what might happen to them if something were to go wrong, because they didn't have execution immunity. He didn't know whether to take it as an honor or a burden to practically act as Charles' replacement. To him it was both. One reason for it being the latter was the actual physical work, and the other was it being a daily reminder that the young man had died for nothing. He didn't do it, he didn't deserve it, and Du could write a list on why the one giving all those atrocious trial sentences should suffer the most gruesome consequences possible. Yet, whenever he slightly mentioned his opinion on the ruler they were working for, Avery shut down completely. He would change topics, stay silent, or sometimes even defend him for doing what he did, and even though Du was mad, he couldn't get himself to be seriously mad at Avery. The more time passed, the more Du began to understand his partner's self-image, which was engraved into his brain like the scars into Du's face. The constant slurs being thrown against his head obviously didn't make it any better, but they became less after the general threatened anyone to say a word against either of the female comrades, to have their salary drastically cut. Sue told him as they were leaving the dining room. Apparently she also had to spend several shifts in that room as well, and she hated it as much as Du did. He asked himself in secret why she had not quit her job. Just 2 weeks later he got an answer. Sue's brother had suffered from a fatal injury and was fully dependent on medical care. Even though she hated everything about it, she had sworn her loyalty to the king for as long as she would live, and now he was under his wing. A very inflammatory wing. Then, during the last day of the month, it finally worked. Du had the time, energy and desire to go to the lake, and so did Avery. They made their way through the forest as they did the last 3 times they had went together, and Du noticed that particular smell of fresh leaves and needles, which gave him the feeling that of there actually being the freedom to go wherever he wanted to. No borders, no cities who fought against themselves, no army that blocked roads for everyone, and nobody wanted his flesh on a plate. The last point hadn't been an issue for quite some years. Even though his skin and hair color were still somewhat of a rarity in Bota, people didn't think of him as something to be eaten. The transition had been painful. It had been a day just like this one, but somewhere near the border of Rainburg. There had been a large lake, different from his home, surrounded by hills, and the next settlement being half a day of walk away. Just shortly after Avery had basically revived Du from dehydrating in a dried-out riverbed, he had brought him there. They had gone by foot, long distances, and all that with another person in his arms would have been way too much of a burden for the young dragon hybrid. Du, not owning any kind of clothing except a torn sail he had tied together around his waist and chest with any kind of rope-like object, and some sort of blanket from his new companion to at least partially protect him from the sun, had struggled a ton. Barefoot and on land and all day. The amount of times he had fallen down or had to pause due to smaller injury had been as comforting as holding a boiling pot of water in bare hands. Still, Avery had been patient. That had also been the time where Du first learned of the other one's unusual abilities. He healed his wounds without even laying a finger on him, and it barely left a scar. Du would have asked if that was a normal thing for humans to do, but he couldn't, with the only words he could safely use being yes, no, fish, kill, and merling. The new body of water had been an absolute dream to him. It provided a home, shelter, food, exercise, and entertainment. Sometimes, over the course of the next couple of days, Dew had noticed Avery either staring towards the direction in which the other humans lived or the water surface. Then Dew would dive upwards and had nothing but his eyes peek out of the water and swim towards the other one, which made him laugh. If he had wanted to leave, he could have, but he stayed with the Merling and inhabited a small cave around 3 minutes away. He never ate or drank, which Dew had found incredibly strange, especially when his fish offerings were rejected and he had to eat them all by himself. That was when they slowly began to talk and interact more. Sometimes Dew would surprise him, sometimes the other way around. Something about interacting with someone who seemed to be about his age was very refreshing to him. Other Merling kids barely ever did anything more interesting than chasing around tiny fish and making a mess in the mud on accident. On the day he had become human, he caught himself a meal. To him it was easy to grab an unsuspecting fish even while being fully submerged in the water and hold it until it was ready to be eaten. Then it had gotten boring, so he climbed outside the lake and went to look for his friend. When he eventually found him, Dew declared the hybrid didn't look all that good. Perhaps it were his glowing palms and eyes mixed with the pink aura around him. The Merling considered it could potentially be unnatural and dangerous. Dew, not knowing what was happening and what he was supposed to do, had stepped closer, and when he noticed a small stream of blood coming out from the beginning of the horns, he was confirmed something was going wrong. Panicky, he had made a mistake to grab and shake Avery's, whose head jerked backwards in response, while the body, which was stiffened moments before, collapsed. The next thing Dew remembered was a bright light which blinded him. Then he felt how he hit the ground and everything went black. Slowly a tickling sensation started at his chest and rapidly spread across his whole body. His hand reached for his head and chest, completely disoriented and helpless. And the sensation got stronger until it was more of a soft stinging, and he shouted in fear of what was happening. It was as if a net was pulled over him and tightened and tightened, and more his skin felt as if it was inverting itself, and he couldn't breathe through his gills, so he gasped for air through his mouth as if he would die any moment. Perhaps that was the first time he had ever cried. Then there were his eyes, pinched and stretched as if with steel claws. Finally he passed out, and when he woke up again, everything was gone. No more pain, not even the slightest bit of a tickle. And he looked down on himself, and he was as pale as the moon, and Avery was holding him while apologizing through sobs. But at present he was smiling. It was just like last time. No one was around, and once again Dew had to question himself why there was a path so well preserved to this location, if barely anyone used it. Then Avery put his grape on the ground, sat down on it, put some of the other items to the side, and began to read. Today it was a history book, including several festivities and their backstory belonging to Bota. Meanwhile, Dew put his clothes to the side and went inside the lake. The temperature was bearable. He had to walk several meters until being halfway submerged in the water. Then he dove inside. His human eyes were more sensitive and saw even less, but he didn't need to see. There wasn't much anyway, and it was enough just to drift from one end to the other. It was easy without any obstacles in his way, different from what he was used to from home. As he surfaced, after a minute, Avery was nothing but a stick figure in the distance, still reading, not drowning. Perhaps that kind of worry was a little bit unrealistic and overdue. Dew dove back down and reached the rocky ground, which wasn't even 5 meters under the surface. There he stayed, partially opened his eyes to look towards the surface, and felt at peace. In less than a year he could do that more often. He wouldn't even have to fear being hunted, because people thought all Merlings were dead, and he wasn't one. And then he wouldn't even have to worry about being alone. He was with Avery, and he wouldn't leave him. He took a deep breath in and felt the water stream through his mouth, neck, and lungs before escaping through his gills. The coolness matched his body, the taste was familiar. Wait. His hands reached for the sides of his torso. That wasn't supposed to happen, but he could actually breathe, and he wasn't drowning, and there were those gaps in his flesh. Had he really stopped looking at himself so much that he didn't notice his skin opening? His fingers began to dig through his flesh, and really, there were gills. He wasn't hallucinating. Dew wanted to cry. He really wasn't hallucinating. As if haunted, he rushed back to where Avery was sitting, his head bursting through the surface of the water while the cold clawed at his skin. He could feel the rocks underneath him. There he sat down, so the low water reached up to his hip. Only after Avery looked up from the book and at him with concern written all over his face, Dew noticed he was panting and water dripped out of his own mouth, nose, and gills. "Your skin," the dragon hybrid said. The next terrifying realization Dew had to make that there were a few tiny dots across his arms and torso. They were a grayish blue. Am I turning back? I can't be turning back, can I? This was permanent. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. They would take him and lock him in a tank. I have no clue. And then they would treat him like an animal and force him to restore his lowly race. And then they would cup him up and eat him. Can you fix it? I don't want this, he almost shouted and drew his fingernails across his skin. Wait, you barely heard Avery say, because his breath blocked every other noise from coming through, and his eyes were pinched shut so he couldn't see his sickness. There was the urge to bite and scratch and tear everything off, the spots, his skin, everything. Its nails sunk deeper into his flesh, until his hands were taken and he felt a tickling all over his skin, which forcefully stopped most of his breathing as his gills were shut tightly. He coughed out the last few drops of water as he was pulled forwards and felt cloth against his aching skin and hot hands who had let go of his own on his back. There, you're back," Avery whispered soothingly into his ears. Exhaustion drenched his voice. Dew reopened his eyes. Then he hugged back, wanting to absorb this feeling of being anchored to safety through this person. His arms at least turned back to the pale skin tone. His arms, those wrecked arms with the carvings and the bone showing through around the wrist, and the light hair which was not enough to be seen but still enough to be seen by him, and he hated everything about his arms. He wanted to cry but wouldn't. Not about himself. "Do you want to keep swimming or are you done here?" he was then asked. "Give me a moment," Dew wanted to reply, but no words could be uttered, and he loosened his grip. Avery's clothes were soaked in the water up to his waist and a little bit on his chest and back. He had gotten into the water just to comfort the disfigured wannabe human. Shame. Ashamed, he kept sitting in the water with his hands in his lap and stared at his ever-changing reflection on the water surface. When he looked up again, Avery sat on a dry land only 1 meter and a bit away from him, with his arms and head on his knees. His eyes were fixed in an unspecified point in the distance. Dew's heart almost stopped, eyes immediately changing direction. Most of the wet clothing was laying in the grass to be dried by the sun. Dew had seen a tight bandage which was wrapped in an X shape across his chest. The area around it was spotted with blue and greenish yellow. Bruises. So this was what he had been doing to himself to stay unnoticed. The Merling's hand unconsciously went to his own collarbone, as if he was feeling the pain himself. "How long have you been wearing these?" Dew asked carefully, the impression refusing to leave his mind. He heard the other shrug. "For 3 years, maybe." "Is it uncomfortable?" "Very. I can't run for long because it keeps me from breathing properly, and it aches on my wings. Binding is hard with those flappers. At least it's effective." The hint of a smirk was in Avery's voice. "Why are you still wearing them, though? They know, and you look hurt." After asking, he felt slightly stupid. Some knew while some didn't, but in any case Avery was now capable of defending himself. Dew had also become capable of defending himself by proving his humanity. Still, it was safer not to be what birth decided without one's consent. Seeing himself in a scenario where his now partner couldn't change him back, he knew what he would do. Wrap his arms, wrap his legs, hide his face. "I guess I don't have to," he then replied, laughing dryly. "Besides, it might actually be more practical, so you don't have to suffer any consequences once we're official." Then he untucked one end of the bandages and began loosening the wrapping on his chest. His face went pale as he noticed his eyes had gone back and began stammering excuses, but was interrupted by Avery puffing out a chuckle. She said it was okay for her. She said she would do it for him. There was everything wrong with seeing her this way for the first time. It wasn't the body of a man. It wasn't what he had imagined and what his disgusting mind had made him dream about. What he had felt with every hug had been a mold made up of bindings and cushion. It had left deep marks in her skin, whom he wished weren't necessary. She had scars as well. He could see now that she sat up straight. Slim ones as the blade of a sword had only scratched her until being guided away by the solid scales. There weren't many, which amazed him. And then there was this other thing which he always knew of, but still caught him off guard. She was muscular. No knight would have ever admitted a person in the body of a woman could achieve this amount of strength, and even he himself couldn't comprehend at first sight how his prior image of the strong man he had somehow fallen for matched the obvious feminine appearance. She was, he had to admit, what he wanted a fraction of for himself. Liu stared back at his reflection. What a sad and pitiful view. He understood why people like Tiana thought he was dumb. He looked poor because he used to be. He looked as if he was unable to take care of himself because he used to be. He lay down on his side. The ground was hard. He couldn't breathe, but it would take a while for him to need more air, and he decided he would just stay like that for as long as possible. Why exactly he thought it was a good idea he didn't know, probably just to have himself some quiet to suck off his self-hatred. Perhaps then Avery would come to realize that she could have standards, that she didn't need to choose the puny, nameless creature. But then he was being pulled up, and the cold air sent goosebumps over his bare skin. Not for long, though, because Avery guided the two of them further into the lake with her hands lightly pushing his shoulders. "I know that face," she commented, placing one hand under his chin, thereby making him look up into her unsettling eyes. "Great, I must be looking pitiful." Her mouth twitched before she claimed, "Only because you say so about yourself. And now you're going to tell me that you've seen much worse, that it doesn't matter and all that." Drew recounted the things Josephine had said to him from time to time. "And invalidate your experience? No, that's like a seeing person telling a blind person that he wouldn't want to see some of the things of the world, and that there was another blind person who was completely satisfied with his situation. Sue told me to just be a woman from the start, but it feels wrong, even though it's my body, so I personally just hope to throw away that flesh suit at some point, but until then I'll have to wait." Her hand moved from under his chin over his cheek, and he leaned into it while putting his own hand on top, and she didn't shake it away like that one time. And it felt good. During that time, she took his other hand and placed it on her shoulder. "I guess we have to make the best of it. You sure make me believe it might be worth a try." And for one moment Dew forgot about his ripped lip, his dry skin, the scars, his thin and messy hair, his deformed ears, visible cheekbones, bony torso, and whatever there else was. Once he allowed it, it was as if her heat traveled through his mouth into his entire head like a flame on cotton. He was damned inside his body, but at least it felt good for the moment.